Trapped in a deadly wildfire, a firefighter and a photographer risk everything to save lives. This is a true story of bravery and survival you won't want to miss. Stay tuned for the full journey, and make sure to like, subscribe and share for the next part. Coming soon. Welcome my YouTube channel Storytime. Nestled at the edge of a vast, forested expanse in Northern California lay the quaint town of Ashwood. Known for its serene beauty, the town thrived on tourism and the simple lives of its 5,000 residents. Towering pines, crystal-clear rivers, and chirping wildlife surrounded the area, painting a picture of tranquility, until nature turned its other face. It started as a typical summer day. The sun blazed overhead, and a dry wind rustled through the brittle leaves. The residents went about their routines, unaware of the growing threat looming in the distance. A lightning strike during a rare, dry thunderstorm ignited the forest floor miles away. The fire was small at first, but the combination of parched vegetation and gusty winds turned it into an unstoppable force. As smoke began to rise, the town's fire department received the first call. Jake Carter, a 38-year-old veteran firefighter, had seen his fair share of wildfires. With his rugged face and calm demeanor, he was respected by his team and the town alike. "We've got a situation," Jake announced as he gathered his team for a briefing. His voice carried urgency, though he remained composed. "Reports of smoke about 10 miles northeast. Winds picking up, it's headed our way." "Let's move," he commanded. The team suited up, their faces a mix of determination and trepidation. For Jake, it wasn't just about saving lives and property, it was about protecting the town he called home. Meanwhile, across town, Emily Harper, a 27-year-old wildlife photographer, was returning from a trek in the forest. Her camera was loaded with shots of deer grazing near a stream and an eagle soaring high above the canopy. Emily had always felt a deep connection to nature, one that often kept her in the woods longer than was wise. As she drove back, Emily noticed the thickening smoke in her rearview mirror. Pulling over, she stepped out and stared at the ominous sight. Her first instinct was to warn the locals, but as a lover of wildlife, her thoughts quickly shifted to the creatures trapped in the blaze's path. By mid-afternoon, the fire had grown, and Ashwood's residents were alerted to prepare for evacuation. Sirens wailed, and announcements echoed through the streets, "A wildfire is approaching Ashwood. Please evacuate immediately." Panic rippled through the community as families hurriedly packed their belongings. Jake and his team reached the edge of the fireline, greeted by a scene that could only be described as apocalyptic. Flames licked at the treetops, casting an orange glow against the darkening sky. The heat was suffocating, and the air reeked of burning wood and ash. Jake's heart pounded as he coordinated the efforts to contain the fire. "Stay sharp and stick together," he barked, gripping his fire hose. Back in town, Emily made a controversial decision. Instead of heading to the evacuation center, she packed her camera gear and a first aid kit, determined to help the animals she had come to know so well. Driving to a familiar trailhead, she ventured back into the forest. The closer she got, the more the smoke stung her eyes and throat, but her resolve didn't waver. As the hours passed, the fire showed no mercy. Jake and his team fought tirelessly, creating fire breaks and dousing flames wherever possible. However, the shifting winds made their task increasingly dangerous. Jake's mind raced with strategies, but deep down, he knew they were battling nature on its terms. Emily, meanwhile, came across her first victims of the fire, a family of deer trapped near a smoldering grove. Using her jacket to fan the flames away, she managed to guide them toward safety. But the forest around her was quickly becoming a labyrinth of fire and smoke. By nightfall, Ashwood was under siege. The fire's glow could be seen from every corner of the town, and embers rained down like fiery snowflakes. Jake radioed his team, "We need to pull back, this is bigger than we anticipated." Reluctantly, they retreated, regrouping to plan their next move. Emily, now deep in the forest, realized the gravity of her situation. The fire was spreading faster than she had anticipated, and the trail back to her car was engulfed in flames. Alone, with only her camera and limited supplies, she found herself trapped. As the night wore on, the fire continued its relentless march toward Ashwood. Jake and his team prepared for another assault, knowing the fight was far from over. For Emily, the battle had become personal, a fight for survival not just for herself, but for the creatures she had sworn to protect. Unbeknownst to both, their paths were about to cross in a way that neither could have foreseen, setting the stage for a tale of courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable human spirit. The sun rose behind a thick veil of smoke, casting an eerie orange hue over Ashwood. The town was eerily silent, save for the distant roar of the wildfire and the occasional crackling of flames in the forest. For Jake Carter, sleep had been a distant memory. After regrouping overnight, he and his team prepared to head back into the inferno. The fire was now only a few miles from the town's outskirts, and time was running out. "Today's going to be worse," Jake told his crew during the morning briefing. His voice carried both authority and concern. "The winds are shifting, and temperatures are expected to rise. Stick to the plan, watch each other's backs, and don't take unnecessary risks. We've got lives to save, let's move." The team loaded into their fire trucks and headed toward the advancing flames. As they neared the fire line, the scene grew more chaotic. Trees snapped and fell, sending sparks flying. Animals darted across the road, fleeing the flames. Jake's jaw tightened as he surveyed the destruction. "This fire isn't just burning the forest, it's consuming everything in its path," he thought grimly. Meanwhile, Emily Harper was deep in the woods, navigating through the smoke-filled air. Her determination to save wildlife had kept her going, but the reality of her situation was beginning to sink in. Her throat burned from inhaling smoke, and her water supply was dwindling. She clutched her camera tightly, as if the images she captured could somehow make her ordeal worthwhile. As she moved further into the forest, Emily stumbled upon a small group of hikers, a family of 3 who had been camping when the fire broke out. The father, Daniel, looked exhausted, carrying his unconscious teenage son on his back. "We got lost trying to find a way out," he explained, his voice hoarse. Emily's heart sank. The fire was closing in, and she knew they had little time to waste. "We need to move now," she said firmly, taking the lead. With the father carrying his son and the mother clutching a small backpack, the group followed Emily through the smoky wilderness. At the fire line, Jake and his team were in the thick of it. They worked tirelessly to create containment barriers, but the fire was unpredictable. "Jake, the wind's shifting again," one of his crew members shouted. Jake cursed under his breath. The flames were now spreading in a direction they hadn't anticipated, threatening to cut off their escape route. "Fall back to the trucks," Jake ordered. As the team retreated, he caught a glimpse of movement through the smoke. At first, he thought it was an animal, but then he realized it was a person, Emily, leading the hikers through the inferno. "Hey! Over here!" Jake yelled, waving his arms to get their attention. Emily turned, relief washing over her face as she saw the firefighters. The group hurried toward Jake, but their path was blocked by a wall of flames. "Stay where you are," Jake shouted. He and his team quickly deployed hoses, dousing the flames to create a narrow passage. Emily and the hikers rushed through, coughing and gasping for air. Once they were safely behind the fire line, Jake approached Emily. "What the hell were you doing out there?" he demanded, his frustration evident. "I was trying to help," Emily replied, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "These people needed me." Jake shook his head but couldn't deny the courage it took for her to venture into the fire. "You're lucky we found you when we did," he said. Emily glanced at the firefighters, covered in soot and sweat. "And I'm grateful. Thank you." But there was no time for pleasantries. The fire was still advancing, and Jake's radio crackled with updates. "Chief, we've got embers jumping the line. It's heading toward the east sector. Jake turned to his team. We've got to move. Get them to safety, he said, nodding toward Emily and the hikers. I'm not leaving, Emily said firmly. Jake looked at her in disbelief. You don't understand what you're up against, he said. I do, she replied. But there are still animals out there, and they don't have anyone looking out for them. Jake hesitated, torn between respecting her determination and wanting to ensure her safety. Stay close to us, he finally said. And don't do anything reckless. As the group moved toward the evacuation zone, the fire continued its relentless advance. Falling trees and choking smoke made every step a struggle. Jake's team worked tirelessly to clear the path, their resolve unwavering despite the odds. For Emily, the journey was an eye-opener. She saw firsthand the dangers firefighters faced and the sacrifices they made. At the same time, she couldn't shake the guilt she felt for putting herself and others at risk. By the time they reached the edge of the evacuation zone, the sun was setting, casting an eerie glow over the smoldering forest. Jake radioed for backup, and additional firefighters arrived to assist with the containment efforts. As Emily and the hikers were escorted to safety, she turned to Jake. Thank you for everything, she said. Jake nodded, his expression softening. Just stay out of the fire next time. But Emily wasn't sure she could make that promise. For her, the fire wasn't just a disaster, it was a call to action. The forest was a nightmare of heat, smoke, and chaos as Jake Carter and his team pushed deeper into the flames. Every step was a battle against exhaustion and the overwhelming heat radiating from the walls of fire around them. The wildfire had grown unpredictable, fueled by fierce winds that sent flames leaping from tree to tree. For Jake, the stakes were higher than ever, as he now had both his crew and the rescued hikers to consider. Emily Harper, still reeling from her earlier encounter with the fireline, refused to leave despite Jake's insistence. I'm not abandoning these woods, she had argued. Now, as she trudged alongside the firefighters, she began to realize the full scope of the disaster. The forest she had loved and photographed for years was unrecognizable, a blazing inferno that showed no mercy to anything in its path. The group's progress was slow. Fallen trees and thick smoke made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. The air was thick with ash, and every breath felt like swallowing fire. Jake led the way, his mind racing with strategies to navigate the rapidly changing conditions. His radio crackled constantly with updates from other teams, each one bringing more bad news. Carter, come in, a voice barked through the static. Jake grabbed the radio. This is Carter. Go ahead. Winds have shifted again. The fire's spreading towards Sector 7, right where you're heading. You need to pull back now. Jake cursed under his breath. Sector 7 was a narrow canyon surrounded by dense vegetation. If the fire reached it before they got through, they would be trapped. We don't have a choice, Jake replied. We've got people to get out of here. As the group pushed forward, the temperature seemed to rise with every step. Emily lagged slightly behind, her legs trembling from fatigue. Jake noticed and paused to check on her. You okay? He asked, his voice muffled through his breathing mask. Emily nodded, though her face was pale and streaked with soot. I'll manage, she said, forcing herself to stand straighter. They continued, but soon the roar of the fire grew louder, and the wind carried embers that danced like fireflies in the smoky air. Jake's heart sank as they reached the entrance to the canyon. Flames were already licking at the edges, and the wind was funneled through the narrow passage, turning it into a fiery wind tunnel. This isn't good, one of Jake's crew muttered. Jake assessed the situation. Turning back wasn't an option, the fire had already consumed the forest behind them. We move fast and stay low, he ordered. No stopping, no panicking. Let's go. The group entered the canyon, each person moving as quickly as they could. Emily stuck close to Jake, clutching her camera tightly even as the heat scorched her skin. The hikers followed, their faces etched with fear. Halfway through the canyon, disaster struck. A sudden gust of wind caused a tree to collapse, blocking the path ahead with a wall of flames. The group skidded to a halt, panic setting in as the fire closed in from all sides. "Stay calm," Jake shouted, though his own nerves were fraying. He turned to his team. "We need to create a gap in the flames. Use the hoses and whatever tools we've got." The firefighters sprang into action, directing their hoses at the burning tree. Water hissed and sizzled as it met the flames, but the fire was stubborn, refusing to die down. Emily watched in horror, feeling utterly helpless. Then, she spotted movement in the distance. Through the smoke, she saw a small group of animals, a doe and her fawn, trapped on the other side of the fire. Her heart wrenched at the sight. "Jake, we have to help them," she shouted, pointing toward the animals. Jake glanced over and shook his head. "We can't risk it. Our priority is getting everyone out of here alive. But they'll die if we leave them," Emily protested. Jake hesitated, torn between his duty and Emily's plea. Finally, he sighed. "You stay here. I'll go." "No way," Emily said firmly. "I'm coming with you." Before Jake could argue, Emily darted toward the flames. Jake cursed under his breath and followed, yelling for his team to keep working on clearing the path. The heat was unbearable as Jake and Emily approached the animals. The doe stood protectively over her fawn, her wide eyes filled with fear. Jake sprayed his hose in a wide arc, creating a temporary barrier between the flames and the animals. "Go," he shouted, waving his arms to guide the deer toward safety. Miraculously, the animals bolted through the gap and disappeared into the smoky forest. Jake turned to Emily, who was coughing violently from the smoke. "You're crazy, you know that," he said, half angry, half impressed. "Maybe," Emily rasped, a faint smile on her lips. Their moment of relief was short-lived. Behind them, the fire roared louder, and Jake realized they were out of time. Grabbing Emily's arm, he pulled her back toward the group, who had managed to douse the flames enough to create a narrow escape route. "Move, now!" Jake yelled. The group scrambled through the gap, the fire snapping at their heels. By the time they emerged from the canyon, everyone was drenched in sweat and gasping for air. As they reached a clearing, rain began to fall, soft at first, then harder, until the fire's roar was replaced by the soothing sound of water on leaves. Jake looked around at his exhausted team and the people they had saved. They had made it, but the battle wasn't over. For Jake, Emily, and everyone in Ashwood, the fight for survival was far from finished. The clearing was a brief reprieve, but Jake Carter knew better than to let his guard down. The rain that had begun to fall was light and inconsistent, a cruel tease of relief for a wildfire that showed no signs of stopping. Around him, his crew caught their breath, their faces streaked with soot and exhaustion. Emily Harper and the rescued hikers sat nearby, their expressions a mixture of relief and lingering fear. Jake's radio crackled, breaking the silence. "Carter, come in. The fire's shifting north, winds are pushing it toward the main road. You've got maybe 2 hours to evacuate before your route is cut off." "Copy that," Jake responded. He turned to his team. "We've got to move. This clearing won't stay safe for long." The group quickly gathered their supplies. The plan was simple: follow the narrow trail leading out of the forest and reach the main evacuation route before the fire blocked their path. But the plan didn't account for the unpredictable nature of the wildfire, or the sheer exhaustion of everyone involved. Emily struggled to her feet, clutching her camera bag. Her muscles ached, and her lungs still burned from the smoke she had inhaled earlier. Jake noticed her hesitation and stepped closer. "You good to walk?" he asked, his tone softer than before. "I'll be fine," Emily replied, though she wasn't entirely sure. Jake nodded, then turned to the hikers. The teenage boy, Sam, was still weak from smoke inhalation. His father, Daniel, carried him on his back, his own movements sluggish. Jake motioned to one of his crew members. "Help them out if they need it. We're not leaving anyone behind." The group set off, moving as quickly as they could through the dense forest. The trail was narrow and uneven, littered with fallen branches and debris from the fire. Smoke continued to hang in the air, making every breath a struggle. Jake led the way, his senses on high alert. The fire was unpredictable, and the winds could change direction at any moment. Every crackling branch and shifting shadow put him on edge. Behind him, Emily kept pace, her mind racing with thoughts of the animals she had seen fleeing earlier. "What happens if the fire cuts us off?" Emily asked, breaking the tense silence. Jake glanced back at her. "We keep moving. We'll find another way." It wasn't the most comforting answer, but it was honest. As the group pressed on, the forest became increasingly treacherous. The trail narrowed further, forcing them to move single file. A sudden gust of wind sent a tree crashing to the ground ahead of them, blocking their path. "Damn it," Jake muttered. He turned to his crew. "Get the saws. We need to clear this fast." The firefighters sprang into action, using chainsaws to cut through the fallen tree. The noise was deafening, but it was a necessary delay. Emily and the hikers stood to the side, watching anxiously. Emily noticed something out of the corner of her eye, a small fox limping through the underbrush. It stopped and looked at her, its eyes wide with fear. Without thinking, she stepped toward it. "Emily." Jake's voice snapped her back to reality. "Stay with the group." She hesitated but nodded, retreating back to the others. The fox disappeared into the forest, and Emily felt a pang of guilt. The tree was finally cleared, and the group pressed on. The temperature seemed to rise with each passing minute, and the smoke grew thicker. Jake checked his watch. They were running out of time. As they neared the main road, the fire suddenly shifted. Flames erupted on either side of the trail, fueled by the dry underbrush. The group stopped, panic spreading like wildfire itself. "Stay calm," Jake shouted. "We're almost there. Just a little further." But the fire was relentless. A wall of flames blocked their path, and the heat was unbearable. Jake's mind raced as he tried to come up with a plan. "We need to create a break," he said, turning to his crew. "Get the hoses and deploy the fire shelters if necessary." The firefighters worked quickly, spraying water to suppress the flames and clearing a narrow path. Emily watched in awe as they fought the fire with everything they had. "Let's move," Jake yelled once the path was clear. The group ran through the flames, the heat searing their skin. Emily clutched her camera tightly, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. The hikers followed, Daniel carrying Sam with a determination that defied his exhaustion. Finally, they broke through the fire line and stumbled onto the main road. A fire truck was waiting for them, its lights cutting through the smoky haze. Jake turned to his team, his face grim but resolute. "Get them on the truck. We've done what we can here." As the group climbed aboard, Emily looked back at the burning forest. Her heart ached for the animals and the land that had been lost, but she also felt a spark of hope. She had seen courage and resilience in the face of unimaginable danger, and she knew she had to tell this story. The truck rumbled down the road, carrying them to safety. But for Jake and his crew, the battle wasn't over. The fire still raged, and there were more lives to save. The fire truck rumbled down the ash-covered road, its occupants silent as the enormity of what they had survived began to sink in. Emily Harper stared out the window, her thoughts racing as they passed charred trees and smoldering patches of forest. The landscape was unrecognizable, transformed from lush greenery into a blackened wasteland. For Jake Carter, there was no time to dwell on what had been lost. His radio crackled with updates from other teams still battling the wildfire. "Carter, the fires breached the eastern ridge. We need reinforcements now. Jake grabbed the radio. Copy that. We're heading back as soon as we drop off evacuees. Emily turned to Jake, her brow furrowed. You're going back. Jake nodded. There's no choice. The fire's still spreading, and there are more people out there. Emily hesitated, torn between gratitude and concern. She had seen the toll the fire had taken on Jake and his team, their exhaustion was palpable, yet their determination never wavered. As the truck reached the evacuation center, volunteers and medics rushed forward to help the hikers and firefighters. Emily stepped out, feeling the cool air hit her smoke-scorched skin. She spotted a small group of reporters and instinctively reached for her camera. Emily. Jake's voice stopped her. She turned to see him standing by the truck, his expression serious. You've done enough, he said. Take some time to recover. Emily shook her head. I can't just stop. People need to see what's happening here, what you're doing. Jake sighed, recognizing the same stubborn resolve in her that had kept him going all these years. Just be careful, he said before climbing back into the truck. Emily watched as the fire truck roared off into the distance, its siren fading into the smoky horizon. She felt a pang of guilt for staying behind, but she knew her role was different. She wasn't a firefighter, she was a storyteller. The days that followed were grueling. Jake and his crew worked tirelessly to contain the fire, often going without sleep for 24 hours at a time. The wildfire was the largest the region had ever seen, consuming thousands of acres and threatening entire communities. Emily, meanwhile, immersed herself in documenting the disaster. She interviewed evacuees, photographed the destruction, and captured the bravery of firefighters on the front lines. Her images and stories spread quickly online, drawing attention to the crisis and prompting donations from around the world. One day, while photographing a firefighter's efforts to save a stranded deer, Emily's phone buzzed with a notification. Her latest article, titled Heroes in the Fire, Stories from the Ashwood Inferno, had gone viral. Comments poured in, praising the bravery of the firefighters and expressing solidarity with the affected communities. Emily felt a flicker of hope. The world was watching, and that meant change was possible. 2 weeks after the fire was finally contained, Jake stood on the edge of the forest, surveying the devastation. The air was still thick with the smell of smoke, and the once vibrant trees were now charred skeletons. Despite the destruction, there were signs of recovery. Small green shoots had begun to emerge from the ash-covered ground, a testament to nature's resilience. Jake's crew gathered nearby, their faces weary but proud. They had fought the fire with everything they had, and though the scars, both physical and emotional, would remain, they knew they had made a difference. Emily arrived, her camera slung over her shoulder. She had spent the past few days compiling a comprehensive story about the fire, highlighting not just the destruction but also the courage and unity it had inspired. Thought you'd be halfway across the country by now, Jake said as she approached. Emily smiled. I couldn't leave without saying thank you. Jake raised an eyebrow. For what? For showing me what real heroism looks like, she replied. Jake looked away, his expression thoughtful. It's not about being a hero. It's about doing what needs to be done. Emily nodded, understanding his sentiment. She turned her camera toward the forest, framing a shot of the new growth sprouting from the ashes. This isn't just the end of the story, she said. It's the beginning of the next chapter. Jake glanced at the green shoots and allowed himself a small smile. Yeah, he said quietly. It is. That night, Emily uploaded her final piece, titled Rising from the Ashes, Hope in the Aftermath of Disaster. It was shared across social media, sparking conversations about climate change, emergency preparedness, and the importance of supporting first responders. For Jake and his crew, life returned to a semblance of normalcy. The fire was out, but the memories lingered, a reminder of the fragility of the world they fought to protect. For Emily, the experience was transformative. She had entered the fire as a photographer chasing a story and emerged as an advocate for change. As the first rains of the season began to fall, washing away the ash and revealing the forest's first steps toward recovery, one thing was clear: even in the face of devastation, hope could take root and grow. If you like this story, please don't forget like, subscribe and share. Next part coming soon. Thank you for watching my YouTube channel Storytime. And where from you watching my videos? Comment me.